Thank you. I'd like to take a moment just now at the start to recognize the tragedy that occurred last night, not so far from USIP. There was a plane collision with a helicopter just down the river. USIP wasn't here the last time such a tragedy occurred when the aircraft, due to icing conditions, landed on the bridge over 30 years ago. In any case, I want to recognize that, and we wake up mornings with terrible news on a fairly regular basis, but there are ongoing tragedies around the world as well, and part of our mission is to try to find ways to resolve and diminish the likelihood of such things. So thank you for being here today. On behalf of the Institute of Peace, I'm pleased to welcome all of you here, and especially friends and partners over the years, Dr. Doug Johnston and Martine Miller from the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, Dr. David Little, whose foundational research with USIP in the 90s spearheaded the Institute's work on religion, and Kirsten Evans and Peter Mandaville, who have led the USAID Center for Faith-Based Partnerships in the Trump and Biden administrations, respectively. Good to see you all, and thank you. My name is Michael Phelan, and I am the Vice President of the Thematic Center here at the Institute of Peace. The center is home to USIP's Religion and Inclusive Societies program. Excuse me, a little tight. Our oldest thematic program, which focuses on the role of religious actors and institutions who are working for peace and security around the world. This year, we are commemorating 35 years of USIP's work on religion, peace, and conflict. Understanding religion's contributions to conflict and peace, and partnering with religious people and institutions who are pursuing peace is essential to a more secure world. And indeed, as we will hear today, this approach to engaging religion to prevent and resolve deadly conflicts is informed by the deep history and traditions of the United States. As many of you know, USIP was founded in 1984 by Congress as an independent national institute dedicated to the proposition that peace is possible, practical, and essential for U.S. and global security. And we here at USIP seek to embody and empower that heritage. Throughout history, we've heard many great voices of peace emerge from religious communities at home and around the world. We continue to seek those voices. How does USIP meet that imperative? Well, we pursue peace by working on the ground with local partners. We provide people, organizations, and governments with the tools, knowledge, and training to manage conflict so it doesn't become violent, and work to resolve it when it does. Our staff work with local partners to make peace possible every day across the world, from Colombia to Nigeria to the Philippines. Through these peace-building efforts, we help to create conditions for stability, which in turn helps prevent the resort to migration, extremism, and even terrorism. Through our efforts to gird for peace, we make America stronger, safer, and ultimately more prosperous. As Secretary Rubio has recently said, without peace, it is hard to be a strong nation, a prosperous nation, and one that is better off. USIP's leading work on religion, conflict, and peace began with the imperative work of great leaders like Dr. Little, who helped found the religion program here at USIP, who, as I mentioned, we have the honor of having with us. We are so thrilled to be hosting this conversation with the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. Dr. Johnston blazed the trail to recognize the important role of religion in foreign policy. His monumental book, Religion, The Missing Dimension of Statecraft, came out 30 years ago and continues to inform diplomacy and international affairs today. We are truly honored to hear from these distinguished founders of the religion and peace-building field as we reflect on the past 3 decades. We'll begin with a keynote address by Dr. Johnston. I then look forward to hearing from the distinguished lineup of speakers to consider the state of the field today and its prospect in the years ahead. This discussion will be moderated by our Religion Program Director, Palwasha Dakar. Now, it is my distinct privilege, both representing the Institute, but as a fellow retired naval officer as well, to introduce Dr. Johnston. Dr. Douglas Johnston is President Emeritus and founder of the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. He was previously the Executive Vice President and COO of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he also chaired the Preventive Diplomacy Program and Maritime Studies Program. He is a distinguished graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, holds a master's degree in public administration, a PhD in political science, both from Harvard University. Dr. Johnston has served in senior positions in public and private sectors, including as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy, Director of Policy Planning and Management in the Office of Secretary of Defense, Founding Director of Harvard's Executive Program in National and International Security. He is a retired U.S. Navy captain and has served as one of a select group that has commanded a nuclear submarine. His contributions to the field of religion, peace building, and diplomacy are innumerable. As a leader, as a writer, as a visionary, thank you all for joining us here today, and especially Dr. Johnston, welcome. We look forward to your remarks.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you to USIP for hosting this event, and particularly to Martine Miller for initiating and coordinating it. Really, I think it's a rare occasion, and I'm very humbled by it, to say the least. We're here to sort of celebrate the 30th anniversary of this book, Religion, the Missing Dimension of Statecraft. And I thought that it would probably be appropriate to describe a little bit about how it came about and the impact that it's had. The genesis was back when I was teaching a course in international security at Harvard back in 1980. And I got to thinking about life after the wall. I had no idea when the wall was going to come down, but once it did, it was pretty clear that the bipolar confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union had suppressed a lot of religious and ethnic kinds of antagonisms beneath the surface. And once that came off, it would seem that traditional diplomacy would have a real challenge trying to deal with these identity-based conflicts. By the same token, I'd been involved for more than a decade with the National Prayer Breakfast Fellowship, and I had seen instances where individuals were spiritually motivated laypersons were able to reconcile differences between people, between factions, sometimes bringing wars to a halt with no one the wiser for how it took place, because it was all done in confidence. And I thought if this kind of activity could be made known in a compelling manner to our policymakers and diplomats, there might be opportunities for government to reinforce it, to build upon it, but never try to own it, because that would discredit it totally. And to create a new synergy for peacemaking that didn't otherwise exist. So 7 years later, when I was being employed by the Center for Strategic International Studies, I had an opportunity to act upon that thought. And so we started a project called Religion and Conflict Resolution, and struggled for several years, and thanks to USIP, it gave us the initial seed grant of $35,000, but that's not much. And it was only when the wall did come down in '89 that all the foundations that we'd approached finally got the message, and we got funded to the tune of something total of $354,000, every cent of which went into producing this book. The purpose of the project was to examine the positive role that religious and spiritual factors could play in actually preventing and resolving conflict while advancing social change based on justice and reconciliation. And we did this through a series of case studies. 3 of these case studies were about nonviolent struggles for political change. And this involved East Germany, the Philippines, South Africa. 3 were about ending wars already underway in Nicaragua, Nigeria, and Rhodesia. And 1 was about reconciliation in the wake of major conflict. This was about France and Germany in the wake of World War II. And that's the one I'd like to just seize upon to give you a flavor for what the book's about. In the immediate aftermath of that war, a gentleman by the name of Frank Buckman, who headed an organization called Moral Rearmament. He was a Lutheran pastor, but he foresaw that unless something was done to achieve reconciliation between the French and the Germans on a personal basis, history was likely to repeat itself yet again. So he prevailed upon some like-minded colleagues that pooled their resources and purchased a grand old hotel on a mountain peak above, in coast Switzerland, above Montreux at the eastern end of Lake Geneva. It's a setting that I think one can only have heavenly thoughts in. It's so beautiful. But when they took it over, it was pretty dilapidated. It had been used by refugees during the war. So after about 6 months of effort, they then began a process of bringing together over a 3-year period some 2,000 French with 3,000 Germans. And these were preachers, teachers, labor leaders, you name it. It was the movers and shakers of society. And they achieved a lot. And in the course of that, that's when Konrad Adenauer, who was Chancellor of Germany, and Robert Schuman, Foreign Minister of France, met, and they became friends. And later jointly gave birth to Jean Monnet's European Coal and Steel Community Plan, which later morphed into the European Community and now today's European Union. Now, very few people before this book were even aware of that audit trail. And the gentleman who authored the case study on this is named Edward Luttwak, who's a widely renowned military strategist, one of the best in the world. But he took this on and went over there, dug through the archives, did all the due diligence, and concluded, he says, the rapid Franco-German reconciliation after 1945 is one of the greatest achievements of modern statecraft. And very few people really understood that. So that was one of the... now, in the wake of the book's publication, it really hit a responsive chord around the world in the form of over 60 very glowing reviews in prestigious journals like Foreign Affairs, Royal Institute of International Affairs, newspapers, Washington Post, New York Times, full page in the Washington Times, half a page in the London Financial Times. It was just remarkable. I can speak immodestly about this because this is a tribute to the world-class scholars and practitioners who were involved in this effort over a 7-year period, included among which is David Little, the author of one of our chapters. So good to see you again, David. And after a short while, you find that this book made its way into, as a required readings at a lot of universities. In fact, a friend of mine, I think he's here today, I don't see him, but John Unger, pastor, read it at Oxford. But it became a course text, but it also became required reading at the Foreign Service Institute, where we train our diplomats. And in 1999, Japan, interestingly, in Sapio, which is their equivalent of Time magazine, cited it as one of the 12 most important books to read in preparing for the 21st century. So the book itself, though, is it's really about a kind of a limited role for religion in the sense that it's where religious figures or institutions can play a mediating role between two parties in conflict where religion is not involved in the problem. And where this can generally prevail and work is when you've got the approximate alignment of the political, economic, and security factors. That is to say that things have been addressed in such a way there that it enables a breakthrough at a higher level of trust, which is what that religious third party brings to the party. Let me just, to underline the importance of this, I just want to quote a short passage from the book in the foreword by Jimmy Carter. He says, each of the principles at Camp David recognize peace to be both a gift from God and a preeminent human obligation. As the mediator of the talks, I am convinced that to have overlooked the importance of religion for both Sadat and Begin would have resulted in a failure to understand these two men. Such a failure could have had a pervasive and incalculable impact. So that's sort of what the book's about. Several years later, we produced another book that gets to the point of where religion is involved in part of the conflict. And let me read from that forward, just a statement. This is by Lee Hamilton, who was the former chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and widely recognized as one of the most important foreign policy experts in the House. And he says, by the way, when you have religion involved in part of it, then you get to what's called faith-based diplomacy. And he defines it here very aptly. He says, faith-based diplomacy speaks to the heart, mind, and spirit of the combatants, to those things that they hold most dear, not simply to the intellectual or material issues that dominate the practice of realpolitik. In so doing, it provides a transcendent capability that under the right circumstances can resolve differences where all else has failed. Now, I'm mindful of the fact that some of the folks in this audience are possibly going to play a role in the Trump administration. And I wanted to just cite for your benefit that there's another book. It's called Religion, Terror, and Error. Subtitle is U.S. Foreign Policy and the Challenge of Spiritual Engagement. And this is one where it speaks to how we should think about realigning our practice of foreign policy to accommodate religious considerations. And from the foreword of that book by General Anthony Zinni, who was former Commander-in-Chief of the Central Command and also a former U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East. He said, this is a visionary approach that goes beyond the whole of government effort and which expands the current definition of smart power. From my 2 decades of experience in the Islamic world, I'm convinced that the vast majority of Muslims would embrace this approach as a means of clearly expressing their beliefs and enabling them to understand ours. The common elements of the 3 great Abrahamic religions have yet to be tapped as a means of reconnecting societies that have gone off track in their relationships and which need means to connect that go beyond the security, economic, and political approaches that have failed to resolve the pressing issues that divide us. So these gentlemen who were kind enough to provide the forewords were really, I think, very prescient in their own insights and thoughts about these things. Now, back to the book. 5 years after it was published, we established the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. And what that's all about is bridging religion and politics in support of peacemaking, simply put. It was established in 1999. We started on a shoestring. $10,000 is all we had. So it's a bare bones beginning, and been hanging by our fingernails financially ever since, but that's the way this business goes. So what the purpose of the center is to do that bridging function. And over a period of years following, we visited a number of various hotspots around the world. And we confined those hotspots to situations that were of critical consequence to the United States in the hope that, our number one strategic goal was to facilitate the incorporation of religious considerations into the practice of U.S. foreign policy. And that was our hope, that foreign service officers, diplomats, and others, when they see us addressing the religious dimensions of some of these situations, conflict situations, which would otherwise go unaddressed, addressing the religious dimensions, and see what could come from that, that would inspire them to try to change their thinking a bit and take this more seriously. And over time, I think that did work to good advantage. I'll just say that in those trouble spots, we would send inter-religious action teams, where at least one member of the team was of the same religious faith as the people we were working with on the ground. Or if there were more than one faith, we'd have more than one person there from the different faiths. And each one of these situations is unique. It's driven as much by personalities as circumstances. And it requires getting in there and figuring out exactly what is the most strategic approach that can be taken. But in every one of these situations, it called for the practice of empathy. It also called for the practice of what we called organic suasion, trying to build peace from within. And of all of the places we went around the world, Kashmir, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, you name it, I think Pakistan best illustrates what I mean about empathy and organic suasion. Our goal there was to reform the madrasas, including those that gave birth to the Taliban. And what this consisted of was trying to change the pedagogy to create critical thinking skills among the students, because in these tradition-bound tribal cultures, there's not a lot of room for creative thinking. And to expand the curriculums to include the physical and social sciences, including a strong emphasis on religious freedom and human rights, particularly women's rights. And over time, the 8 years that we were involved, we engaged some 2,900 Taliban, madrasa leaders and faculty in this process from about 1,600 different madrasas. At the 8-year point, we passed the baton to an indigenous NGO that we had created, and those numbers now are 28,000 leaders and 12,000 madrasas. So the beat goes on. But I think it's important to understand why we seem to succeed where others had not, particularly the government of Pakistan. And there were 3 reasons. One was we conducted the project in such a way that the madrasa leaders felt it was their reform effort, not something imposed from the outside, which meant that they had a lot of ownership in the change process. Secondly, we inspired them with their own heritage, extending back in the Middle Ages, when madrasas were without peer as institutions of higher learning in the world at the time. It was only European exposure to them that led to our own university system in the West. And you'd be amazed at how many of the traditions and mores of academe find their roots in the madrasas, from the gowns, the mortar boards, the tassels you wear, funding a chair in a given discipline, all from the madrasas. So it's quite remarkable. But I think it would probably be helpful. I'm going to share with you a few vignettes to sort of bring this alive, if you will. And any of you who are falling asleep, maybe this will perk you up a little bit. In one instance, I took our board chairman and the chairman of our executive committee over to Pakistan to visit 3 madrasas that had clear ties to terrorism. And the first one was outside of Karachi in a place called Dabori Town. It was this big madrasa, thousands of students. And we walked into the room, and it was full of rage because Israel and Hezbollah were locked in combat at the time, and anything Israel does, the United States gets the credit for. So to work past that rage, I reminded them of when the United States had intervened on behalf of Muslims in Somalia, Kosovo, Bosnia, Kuwait. And I said, but that's not why we're here today. We're here today to see if we can capitalize on religious values that we share in common to create a better relationship. And then I offered some quotes from the Quran, which I'd committed to memory, and a consolidated paraphrase would go like this: "O mankind, God could have made you one had he willed. But he didn't. He made you into separate nations and tribes so that you may know one another, cooperate with one another, and compete with one another in good works. I said, I and my 2 colleagues are here to open the competition in good works. And I said, the 3 of us happen to be followers of Jesus. And I said, we know you cannot be a good Muslim unless you believe some pretty wonderful things about Jesus. So let's ask ourselves, if he was here in our presence today, how would he want us to interact with one another? Well, in the course over the next hour, that rage was converted to acceptance, bordering on fellowship. It was really remarkable. But then we went up to Lahore and visited a madrasa that was identified with the London bombers. Same scenario, same impact. And afterwards, the madrasa leader, who was a widely revered and somewhat feared individual, interacted with our project director on a couple of occasions. And each time he mentioned the fact that of the presentation we'd made up there and the question about Jesus, he says, it caused me every morning I ask myself, what would the prophet have me do? So, and without any training from us, that madrasa began a series of reconciliation seminars on its own. So you just never quite know what's going to happen once the seed's planted. In another situation, we were conducting a workshop of 16 madrasas surrounding the Swat Valley. Now, the Swat Valley is a resort area in the mountains of Pakistan, which the Taliban had taken over. So heads were rolling. And toward the end of the workshop, one gentleman stands up, a madrasa leader. He was also a commander in Lashkar-e-Taiba, which was the terrorist group that created so much havoc in their attacks on Mumbai, India, a few years earlier. He gets up and he stands up and he says, he says, I came here for one reason and one reason only. It's to discredit everything you have to say. He says, but now, for the first time in my life, I feel like I've experienced the soul of the Holy Quran and its peaceful intent. He said, but I'm full of rage because for 26 years, and he says, I'm going to change what I tell my students and tell them why. Well, a month later, we happened to revisit, and we had a CNN team along who had been wanting to capture some of our work, and he said it to them as well. And after that was over, he said, enough. I think he knew he was on pretty thin ice. Probably only got away with it because he was a terrorist commander. But then in another one workshop, one of the attendees was a Taliban commander of some renown, but he was very despondent. He'd lost 2 sons in the fighting. He says, we don't know what America wants. You come after us with guns, we have no recourse but to respond in kind. So this led to an invitation for me to come to the mountains to speak to their senior leadership on what America wants, which I did 2 months later. In the meantime, I made the rounds at State, Defense, and the agency to make sure that whatever I said was consistent with U.S. policy. And so I found myself, this is up in the Malacan Agency in the northwest frontier province of Pakistan in the mountains, and walk into a room. There's 57 Taliban commanders and several tribal and religious leaders. And I went through my preambles and trying to placate any foreign policy concerns. But then I said, the reason we're here today, and by the way, in each instance I would tell people that we were not from the government, and nor had we received any funding from our government, which was true at the time. But I said why we're here is to see if we can build upon religious values that we both share in common to create a confidence-building measure pointing toward peace, And then we engaged in a couple of hours of discussion, got a bit heated at times, as you might imagine. And at one point, one of the gentlemen stood up, a very tough-looking gentleman. He points his finger at me. He says, I can't talk to you unless you become a Muslim. And I said, well, I said Muslim means submission to God. We all submit to God, therefore all Muslims. And everybody laughed, and we went on with our business. And I found out later that my project director and our indigenous partner, who had spent a month rounding these were all Afghan Taliban commanders who came over the border. They got uptight there because the standard scenario is you convert or you die. Well, I was totally oblivious to all that, and I thought to myself, the Lord really does look out for fools and incompetents. So we broke for prayer, then came back in a smaller group and developed a confidence-building measure. One of the things that was very clear to me was these folks seemed to really care about their people. And they were mortified that billions of dollars were being spent and nothing had made its way down to the village level. So the confidence-building measure built around that angst, and what it called for was establishing a secure zone in about 1/3 of the province of Nuristan, which was right across the border in Afghanistan, and to provide private development assistance that would go into the villages. That was all well and good, except I could not get NATO to buy in on establishing the secure zone. So it failed. But where it did pay off was several months later, I received a call from the Korean ambassador asking if there was anything our center might be able to do to free the 21 Korean missionaries who were being held hostage by the Taliban. This was back in 2007. I think you probably may recall that. And because of the networking that we had done with respect to that meeting in the mountains with the Taliban commanders, we were able to play an instrumental role in getting those missionaries freed. So again, you just never know how all of this is going to play out. So I think that trying to collect my thoughts here, but I think on this business of draining the swamp of terrorism, I just want to tell you that bombs and bullets, they have their place, but that's not what's going to drain the swamp. When you go down that road, you just create more terrorists. The cycle of revenge just takes hold. But if you win hearts and minds, that becomes contagious. And I must say, once you got past the veneer of rage and hostility with these folks, not only do they get it, but many of them became champions of what we were talking about at great personal risk to themselves. So that just, I guess in concluding, I would say I think it's important to understand that empathy is not sympathy. Empathy is doing the hard work to understand why the other party sees the problem the way they do. It might have to do with religious differences, ethnic tensions, some unresolved wound of history, who knows. But once you identify that, then you can look for any common ground to be able to come together. It's when Robert McNamara was asked, what is the biggest failure, what was our biggest mistake in Vietnam? He said it was our failure to empathize with the enemy. He says we did not take the time to really understand the culture and the history. And, you're left with lots of unintended consequences when you don't do your homework. And to cite the words of a revered Chinese general and strategist, Sun Tzu, who wrote the authoritative book on war. It's called The Art of War. In there, he says the supreme art of war is to achieve your objectives without resorting to conflict. I think that's great advice, not only then, but particularly for today. Anyway, thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate it.
Hello, my name is Palwasha Dakar. As Michael mentioned, I'll be moderating the panel, so please may I request the panelists to come join me? Peace be with all of you. And thank you so much for that thoughtful reflection, Dr. Johnston. It's really remarkable that it's been 30 years since you published that book on religion, the missing dimension of statecraft. And so much of the world has really changed, and yet so much of that still is relevant today. So thank you for sharing those stories. On this occasion of the book's anniversary and USIP's 35 years of religion and peacebuilding, it's apt that we take a moment to consider the field of religion and foreign policy more broadly, and religion, peace, and conflict more specifically. We're so fortunate to you, Dr. Johnston, and to Dr. Little here, as the two founding fathers, so to speak, of this field, and that the work that you both did in the 90s was instrumental in shaping how policymakers, diplomats, and practitioners understand religion's place in ending conflict and building peace today. I'm really pleased to be joined on this panel by such distinguished partners and indeed friends, people that I have met prior to my time at USIP, but also worked with here. So let me first start by introducing Dr. David Little, who I met while I was studying at Harvard, and I got to sit in on his classes. This was right after 9/11, and it was a time where we were really thinking about human rights and religion, and it was really a privilege to be able to hear your thoughts at that time when we were all struggling. He's Professor Emeritus of Harvard Divinity School and a former senior colleague here at USIP on religion, ethics, and human rights. He's currently a research fellow at Georgetown's University Berkeley Center and continues to be a leading authority on the history of religious freedom, ethics, and human rights, and religion and conflict resolution. Dr. Little retired in 2009 as the T.J. Dermot Dunphy Professor of the Practice of Religion, Ethnicity, and International Conflict at Harvard Divinity School, and as an associate at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. And until the summer of 1999, he was a senior scholar on religion, ethics, and human rights here at the United States Institute of Peace. And also, he was a member of the Advisory Committee to the State Department on Religious Freedom, which is really important in the history of international religious freedom here in the United States. Martine Miller is the interim president of ICRD and has a long career working across the globe as a mediator and conflict transformation specialist. I first met her actually in Afghanistan, and we've done a lot of work together in this space. But let me go through some of her amazing accolades and achievements. Of course, this is not extensive of everything that she's done, but she's a mediator and conflict transformation specialist with over 20 years of engaged experience in communities and governments. I think what's interesting is the work that she's done in ASEAN, both with non-governmental and governmental organizations and academic institutions. And her work's engaged directly in post-war reconstruction and development contexts across 70 countries on all continents. She derives her formal education that's linking to practical mediation and conflict transformation, and skills from both having a master's in international humanitarian and human rights law and a master's in politics, post-war reconstruction, and development. She has also done engagements with Harvard University's program on negotiation and the International Committee for the Red Cross and Red Crescent, and has been guest lecturers in many universities here around Washington, D.C., but also internationally in Asia. Let me next turn to Kirsten, dear friend of mine, and was so privileged to be able to work with Ms. Kirsten Evans when she was at USAID, directing the Faith-Based Partnerships Office, and we were working together on the Evidence Summit there. She's currently the Vice President of Church and International Engagement at the Catholic University of America, and she was the Director of the Center of Faith and Opportunities Initiatives and acted as a Senior Advisor to USAID's Administrator, Mark Green, on global engagement of the faith-based community. Prior to USAID, she was the Chief Operating Officer of Ecuador by World Fund, a nonprofit organization utilizing public-private partnership for innovative leadership and professional training. She's done work with public school educators in Mexico and Brazil. And in 2014 and 2016, she served as Executive Director in Defense of Christians here in Washington, D.C., advocating for the protection and preservation of religious minorities in the Middle East, shaping U.S. foreign policy, recognizing Christians, Yazidis, and other religious minorities. So not only does she have experience at USAID, but also in advocating for the rights of religious minorities and engaging in that space. She previously represented the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops in its ongoing relationships with Muslim, Jewish, Sikh, Orthodox, and Christian communities. So she has a lot of experience also working in this interfaith space, which we hope to hear from soon. And finally, let me turn to Dr. Peter Mandaville, who has also been a close colleague here at USIP and a mentor as well to me on this program. He's the professor of international affairs in the Shar School of Policy and Government and the director of the Abu Suleiman Center for Global Islamic Studies in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at George Mason University. He also, most recently, served as the director for the Center of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships at USAID, and is the senior advisor for faith engagement at USAID. Prior to that, he was here at USIP with us as our senior advisor for religion and inclusive societies, and started many important initiatives and intra-religious and inter-religious dialogues, and looking at some very important issues related to soft power and religion here at USIP. He also has experience working at the U.S. State Department and as a senior advisor in the Secretary of State's Office on Religion and Global Affairs, which we hope to hear his reflections on as well. And he's been a fellow at Brookings and a fellow at the Pew Research Center, and held multiple affiliations with organizations such as the RAND Corporation and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And he's authored very important books also in this space, including the book on the geopolitics of religious soft power most recently. So with that, I would like to get started with some questions. So first, let me turn to Professor David Little. Your work on religion and peace, human rights, and religious freedom really laid the foundations for some of the work that we pursue here at USIP through our program today. Would it be possible for you to share your reflections on that research that you undertook 30 plus years ago, and the ensuing religion and peace building work that you led at USIP and beyond that time?
Sure. Pleased to be here and to be reassociated with my old colleague, Doug Johnston, who's done such creative work in the field of religion and diplomacy. I was pleased to be somewhat part of that early work, and it's marvelous to renew our acquaintance. I was employed by USIP in 1989, 2 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The demise of the Cold War really exposed a number of things that had been festering for a long time, and most especially the burgeoning spirit of nationalism. That was true, as many of you will either recall or have read about, in places like Bosnia, Sudan, Sri Lanka, Ukraine, and many other spots. In case after case, that spirit of nationalism often was intertwined with religious identity and commitment, and was associated with violence or potential violence, and as such appeared to us at that time to be a worthy subject for study by a newly formed U.S. Institute of Peace. What was it, we asked ourselves, about the dynamics of nationalism, and particularly about the role of religion and ethnicity, that generates violent conflict, and what might be done in response to and to help pacify those dynamics? On the basis of earlier academic work I had done in the field of human rights, and I spent 2 years here before I was hired as a Jennings Randolph Fellow working on human rights and religion. On the basis of that experience, I was well aware of the much advertised link between human rights and peace, prominently declared in all of the human rights instruments. It occurred to me that examining examples of fervent nationalism with the potentiality for violence that those examples seem to hold could provide a very interesting occasion for testing that link between human rights and peace. More especially since religion is such a conspicuous factor, a study of that kind could also help to address the more precise link claimed between religious intolerance and violence. That is, as you may recall, stated very clearly in the preamble to the Declaration on the Elimination of Discrimination and Intolerance. It says, disregard and infringement of human rights and fundamental freedoms, in particular regard to freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief, have brought, directly or indirectly, wars and great suffering to humankind. The general understanding of our approach was that historically, nationalism was the result of the breakup of the sprawling medieval system into a collection of distinct self-governing nation states consisting of particular peoples or nations. It is the conjoining of people and nation, people and nation and state that constitutes the foundations of what nationalism is all about. In short, creating a nation state is what was the basis for the rise of nationalism. And as things turned out, religion seems again and again to be an important part of the self-concept that people have, or nations have, when they set about to form and administer a state. So that link between religion and nationhood, and then the formation of a state, seemed to us to be a very critical nexus that bore investigation. Clearly, religion often plays a crucial role in defining a people, whether it's various Christian groups or later Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, or Muslim groups, giving religious confession and identity a huge influence on the formation and administration of a state. Again and again, both historically and in modern times, there emerged examples of what we at USIP called religious nationalism. That is a form of nation-state in which typically the state privileges one religious group over others, assuring to members of that group special legal and political rights, as well as special economic and social opportunities. Religious nationalism inclines toward authoritarian rule because, by definition, it resists implementing broadly representative political systems and opposes constitutional constraints on executive and legislative power that assure the equal protection under law. It does that in order to favor a particular group over others. The whole logic of religious nationalism drives in that direction. Religious nationalism recognizes a close tie between the favored religion and particular ethnic groups, as, for example, in Sri Lanka, Bosnia, or Sudan, and leading investigators like us to use the term ethno-religious nationalism. That seems particularly appropriate. It's not always the case that religion and an ethnic group team up, so to speak, but it's very frequently the case, and that's worth noting. Observing as we did that the examples I mentioned, Sri Lanka, Bosnia, Sudan, suffered serious forms of violent conflict in the 90s, we took it as one of our study's key objectives to determine the degree to which religious or ethno-religious biasing in matters of law, politics, and economics contributed to the violent conflict, and if so, to provide an explanation for why that is so. How is it that religion in these different cases comes to formulate a favoritism of one group or another and inclines to shape a political system to the benefit of that particular group? That bears historical investigation, and we tried to engage in that sort of investigation in coming to the conclusions that we did. There was a second feature to our approach, which is important to mention, a contrasting form of nationalism, which was less likely, we thought, to form or to cause violent conflict. We called that civic or liberal nationalism, borrowing from the literature. In contrast to religious nationalism, liberal nationalism, ideally at least, enshrines international human rights and guarantees religious pluralism and equal rights under the law, including freedom of conscience, religion, or belief, and the freedom individually or in community with others and in public or private to manifest those beliefs in worship, observance, practice, and teaching, in the language of the human rights documents. Accordingly, liberal nationalism, in contrast to religious or illiberal nationalism, embodies liberal constitutional democracy and the rule of law. In our study, liberal nationalism remained very much an ideal point of reference. In all but one case, we did not touch on examples of it, though we consistently came across instances where, as it seemed to us, a large dose of liberal nationalism might have made a significant difference in reducing conflict. Our broader confidence along those lines rested in the well-tested theory known as the liberal peace. It holds, you'll recall, that at the international level, pairs of democratic states with a high incidence of rights protection have a low risk of military conflict with each other, though it must be stressed they do go to war with non-democratic states with way too much frequency. At the domestic level, similarly, liberal democratic states having a strong record of implementing equal rights experience less internal violent conflict than non-liberal examples. While I was at USIP, we published 3 separate studies on Sri Lanka, Tibet, and Ukraine. We also began work on Sudan and Bosnia, and I carried that work farther when I went to Harvard in 1999 and later published a book comparing the findings on Sri Lanka, Bosnia, and Sudan with the case of Iraq. So my purview broadened as I left USIP and went to Harvard. The cases of Sri Lanka, Sudan, and Bosnia, including Iraq, were all fairly consistent examples of ethno-religious nationalism with the expected propensities toward violence. In Sri Lanka, Bosnia, and Iraq, conditions have improved somewhat compared to the worst periods in in their history, but not much, I fear, at the fundamental level has changed, and it is not helping, therefore, those countries to move from an illiberal to a liberal form of nationalism. Sudan, as we all now, to our distress, know, is experiencing very violent and extensive ethno-religious conflict in Western Darfur. While the Han Chinese do not invoke religious warrants to oppress the Tibetans, the abusive effects of their ethnic bias continue to match the effects of a standard case of religious nationalism. Thanks to the Dayton Accords, the Bosnians are now not at war, but ethno-religious tensions seem recently to have flared up, showing again that the fundamental characteristics, which we worried very much at the time of the Dayton Accords, have not really been fundamentally addressed. Our study of Ukraine is a kind of outlier. In the 1990s, Ukraine was experiencing substantial ethno-religious conflict, not with high levels of violence, but it was very unclear to us at the time which way Ukraine was going to go. In our interviews, we saw some prospects for liberal improvement, which happily later materialized to an important degree. As we interviewed church officials, civil society leaders, and legislators, they seemed committed to supporting a religiously pluralistic society and providing significant space for the practice of religious freedom. The irony, of course, is that the serious efforts of Ukraine to move in a liberal from a religious national direction were thwarted not mainly by internal resistance, but by the external violent intrusion of a particularly distressing example of religious nationalism, namely Putin's Russia. So in some ways, the message comes home in very remarkable ways. The positive point about the self-generated liberalization of Ukraine leads me to emphasize that in our studies, we were constantly looking for local actors, and particularly religious actors, who were trying their best to break the death grip that religious nationalism seemed to have on those countries and move things in a different direction. And they did that by reinterpreting, much along the lines that Doug was talking about, reinterpreting their traditions in accord with a more pluralistic, shared, inclusive, diverse, if I may use that term, orientation. They found fresh ways to find connections between their traditions and support for human rights, democracy, and so on. We were able to identify some such actors in all the cases, though in most cases they were a very distinct minority. Ukraine was the only case where those representatives, very, very importantly religious representatives, gained prominence mainly after our study was over. I should add in conclusion that I'm well aware that the foundations of the liberal peace theory, and by implication the derivative conclusions of our USIP studies that I have drawn, they are vigorously being challenged and contested these days on all sides. The idea that there exist valid, universal, morally based human rights standards aimed at creating a just peace and holding to account the hegemonic interests of governing powers is hardly altogether completely accepted this day in academia and elsewhere. All I can say is I am devoting my declining years to defending those foundations as vigorously as I can, and I must emphasize that they were deeply strengthened by my work at USIP. I conclude by calling attention to the present-day virulence of religious nationalism across the globe. Israel, India, Iran come immediately to mind, but we mustn't leave out of account the United States of America. In a crowd like this, there is no need for me to belabor the evidence in favor of the rise of what is known as white Christian nationalism and the influence politically and socially that that movement is having. The key question now, as in our USIP studies, is where will we find those religious actors and others who are committing to the thwarting the advance of religious nationalism and its propensity for hostility and violence. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Little, and giving us that history, the historical perspective, and how history has really laid out the importance of religious freedom, and the examples that you gave were very real, considering the conflicts that are ongoing in many of the places that you looked at, including Ukraine and Sudan. Thank you for sharing that. Let me now turn to Kirsten and Peter. You've both served at the helm of the Faith-Based Partnerships Office at USAID under the past two administrations. Kirsten, you were under the first Trump administration, and Peter under the most recent Biden administration. Could you share what religious engagement has looked like in the context of the efforts that you've led through the U.S. government's International Development Agency? Let me start first with Kirsten. Over to you.
Palwasha, thank you. Is that on? Yeah. So thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Little, for your remarks, and thank you, Palwasha, for the invitation and for the generous introduction that you gave earlier today. If you don't mind, Peter, I'll kind of jump in and make a few comments. And so the question being a little an understanding of the landscape, right, of religious engagement at the United States Agency for International Development. I want to start by making very clear I don't speak on behalf of the current Trump administration, nor am I authorized to, nor do I pretend to, right? That's not my role or my task. I'm very proud of the work that we did in the agency under the 45th presidential administration. I think we made amazing strides in the agency on many levels, and including on this topic. And I'm very proud of that work. But I do want to make clear that I'm not here on behalf of Secretary Rubio or the current administration. So, you know, when we arrived at USAID in the 45th administration, and I guess it would have been 2017, tasked with this office for faith-based engagement, right? One of the things that, having come from the space and having worked in advocacy for religious minorities here in Washington, having worked in the interfaith space, one of the things that was sort of obvious to me is that the State Department had this kind of renaissance. And I know my State Department colleagues, James is here, and others might push back on that a little bit. But the State Department had this renaissance with regard to its broader conversation on the role of religious actors in U.S. foreign policy. We had a very robust and active Office for International Religious Freedom that had done phenomenal work across many administrations. There had been a resurgence of interest in engaging religious actors, strategic engagement in foreign policy itself across the globe. And so there was a lot of intellectual heft and policy savviness that had been built around these topics in the State Department. And interestingly, for whatever reason, at USAID, it was a little bit more sparse, right? A little bit more scarce. And that was kind of interesting to me, because if there's one arm of the United States foreign policy apparatus that deals with faith-based organizations day in and day out and day in and day out, and it's the United States Agency of International Development, by the very nature of the work that it does in the humanitarian space, in helping to build stronger, more stable societies through education, through healthcare. Faith-based communities are our consistent partners in the work that we do. And so one of the things we wanted to do coming into the administration was to really elevate the conversation around the partnership that we do have with faith-based communities globally in the work that we do. Bring that to the forefront of the agency's conversations and elevate the broader conversation. One large priority we had was to kind of thread the needle or thread the two strings of the tie, if you will, between the conversations on international religious freedom and the conversations on strategic religious engagement. And for whatever reason, and I'm not entirely sure why, but someone else might enlighten me that, it had felt like as time had gone on, those two conversations became more and more polarized politically in the United States, right? There was kind of a very robust conservative camp around international religious freedom, and the perception was that the strategic religious engagement camp was more left-leaning, right? And there was what I would say a very artificial understanding of a kind of U.S. political dynamic that was being placed on these conversations. And so one of the first things that we wanted to do was to help tie those threads, and we did that when Secretary of State Pompeo announced the Ministerial to Advance International Religious Freedom in 2019. USAID stood up and said, we want to participate, and we'd like to put together a 2-day track, a 2 or 3 day track at this stage. I can't remember how many days it was. And our entire conversation was about this symbiotic relationship, how international religious freedom enables the United States government to do better partnership work on the ground in our foreign policy goals, but also how those partnerships that we have on the ground also help to generate long-term a better landscape for the universal human right and civil and political rights of international religious freedom. And so this very symbiotic yin and yang relationship between the two, and I guess in some ways trying to dispel the idea that these are two separate entities, it's really the trajectory of one long conversation, right? It's an arc of a single conversation on how the U.S. government approaches the reality of religious actors in our foreign policy. And so that was one major priority that we had. We also wanted to elevate the conversation internally in the agency, and we realized that a lot of our workforce was still very sheepish when it came to partnering with faith-based organizations internationally. They were afraid that they were going to overstep their bounds, that they were going to inadvertently walk into dangerous territory between the separation of church and state. And so we wanted to elevate that conversation internally as well, and we launched an evidence summit for strategic religious engagement inside of the agency in order to better educate our own workforce on how they could interact with religious actors and faith-based organizations in the field in order to better achieve their goals and also do so comfortably. Launching as well some training, which I know still continues to take place. We look to lower the barriers for faith-based organizations that wanted to work with USAID. We heard consistently with our faith-based partners that they felt that they were given undue scrutiny, and they were often overlooked because of their religious identity for partnership opportunities with the U.S. government. And so we worked very hard to lower the barriers that faith-based organizations would find it easier to become an active partner with the U.S. government in the humanitarian or development work that they were doing globally. And we put a strong priority on as well, making sure that we were protecting the consciences of our own religious partners in the policies and that we put into place. So a deep sensitivity towards the religious convictions of those communities themselves, and trying to put strong safeguards against instrumentalization or coercion, in which those communities could potentially feel that they were either used or coerced for policy ends or policy goals which didn't actually reflect their religious convictions. So those were some of the concerns and some of the priorities that we put into place, and I know my time is up. So I'll leave it at that and let Peter move on. So thank you.
Thank you so much for going over that history. It's really important to hear that. Let me turn over to Dr. Mandaville.
Yeah, thank you very much, Palwasha. I mean, I'm delighted to say that during my time leading USAID's Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, as it was called during the time, so much of what we did was actually about building on the enormous progress that Kirsten had made. And I'm delighted to be able to say this because it speaks to a much important larger point here, which is the fact that in a time in which there is so little consensus in this country about anything, having an area in which there is bipartisan consensus is incredibly important. I'm happy to say that what we have been calling in recent years strategic religious engagement in U.S. diplomacy and development is one of those rare areas of bipartisan consensus. The center that Kirsten and I had the privilege of leading was first established in 2002 under the George W. Bush administration, and its mandate has been renewed by every administration since, Republican or Democrat. And there's power in that. During my tenure, during the Biden-Harris administration, USAID released the agency's first ever policy on strategic religious engagement. We're very proud of this because it wasn't just USAID's first official policy on religious engagement, it was also the first time that any US government agency had developed and publicly released an entire official policy explaining why partnership with faith-based actors is an integral component of the work that agency does. But there's an aspect of this policy that we launched that also points back to that broader point about bipartisan consensus. While it was indeed launched here at USIP by former USAID Administrator Samantha Power in September 2023, the work to create that policy actually began during Kirsten's time. Indeed, I'll go further. I would say that a majority of the text of the policy as released was actually drafted under Kirsten's leadership. Now, that's an incredible thing to be able to say, that a Democratic administration received a policy architecture from a Republican administration, took a look at it, made a few tweaks, and then released it. We don't see that happening very often. And so I think there is power in this space of religious engagement for us to forge and find new areas of consensus as a nation going forward. What I briefly want to say about kind of what we sought to prioritize at USAID's Faith-Based Center during the time that I was there was really kind of three main things. One is to enhance the capacity of the USAID workforce to systematically integrate partnership with faith-based organizations and actors into the work they do. USAID had been working with faith-based organizations since the 1960s, since the agency opened its doors. The establishment of the center kind of allowed us to start thinking more systematically about that. But what we've been trying to do over the last year during my time there was to kind of turn religious engagement almost into a technical discipline. Those of you who are familiar with USAID will know that it's a very technical place. There are procedures. There's, because USAID is mainly about moving resources around, there are naturally and appropriately a lot of regulations and compliance requirements. Very technical place. What we wanted to do was to make religious engagement akin to a technical discipline that would be able to interface effectively with the agency's other standard operating procedures and things like the training that Kirsten mentioned that we've been delivering in partnership with James Alexander and the State Department's Office of International Religious Freedom. It's a very important part of that. Second, and knowing that there are ongoing questions about U.S. foreign assistance, questions about the value of that, the resources committed to it, we also see faith-based partnership as an opportunity for burden sharing, if I can put it that way. While USAID has often relied on faith-based organizations as implementers of its programs, basically providing funding to faith-based organizations to implement our programs, we need to be more aware that in the world today, there are many religious or religion-adjacent entities and organizations that don't want U.S. government funding. They have their own resources. They have their own enormous capacities, and they have values that often align with the goals of U.S. development and humanitarian objectives. And what kinds of partnership opportunities can we create that would allow entities like that to bring their resources and approaches alongside the resources and capacities of the U.S. government to work in partnership? And finally, as we hear in more and more discussions about renewing American leadership in the world, I think that our comfort and our capacity to think about and work with religious leaders is a distinctive aspect of America's place and persona in the world. I think it is an opportunity for us to provide global leadership. And so I, going forward, would love to see us work more to, for example, leverage the religious engagement policy that Kirsten and I were involved in helping to bring to the world. Leverage that as a tool to help foster a greater conversation amongst the U.S. government, our foreign assistance agencies, and other humanitarian and foreign assistance agencies, other official donors and multilateral organizations, so that we can combine our respective approaches and resources to do more of this religious engagement work as effectively as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I think that point about partnerships between religious institutions and U.S. government is so important to bear, and the importance of really being able to have that add-on effect of the two working together. But thank you for also highlighting the importance of this being America's heritage. And, one thing that many of us, myself included, we have ancestors who came here in pursuit of religious freedom. And that is a really important story, as Dr. Little mentioned, about how we understand ourselves and our nation. But the examples that Dr. Johnston gave in his book about the partnerships that can happen really seem to be influencing some of the practices that we're hearing from Kirsten and Dr. Mandaville. And let me just ask one further question, since Peter, you were at State Department as well. Could you reflect on some of the lessons learned from your experience there in doing some religious engagement, which was different than the work that you did at USAID?
Yeah, no, thank you, Palwasha. It was very different to work on these issues at the State Department compared to USAID. And at USAID, there was, in some ways, a much clearer understanding of where religious actors fit into the agency's work just because of the mission, right? Religious and faith-based organizations were, first and foremost, implementing partners. Whereas at the State Department, the questions of how to think about religion in relation to diplomacy, in global diplomacy, were in some ways much more difficult to engage. Part of the challenge is one that Kirsten already referred to, and that is helping to create a space where at the State Department we were talking about religion and religious engagement separately and distinctly from the space focused on the promotion of international religious freedom abroad. Right? Because when the State Department's Office of Religion and Global Affairs was established in 2013, up until that point, the only explicitly religion-inflected office or unit at the State Department was the Office of International Religious Freedom. I think a lot of our colleagues at the State Department heard the word religion and their mind just went immediately to promoting religious freedom. And so what we're trying to do in that office is to say, yes, absolutely, the U.S. government does that, and it does that as a matter of law because of the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, and we do that because it's a crucial component of our broader human rights commitments and human rights function. But there's also a separate, related, complementary, but also functionally separate and distinct set of conversations to be had about what it means and looks like to engage and work with religious actors in order to advance U.S. diplomatic objectives more broadly. And I think, we made some progress in that regard in areas like the role of religion in work focused on combating corruption, issues related to protecting the natural environment and climate change. As USIP knows very well, the role of religion in resolving conflicts and peace building work. But, I left both my time at State Department and USAID, I think, mindful of kind of three core issues as challenges facing the work that we do in this space. One is, again, the point that Kirsten made about the relationship, and often difficult, and sometimes I think unnecessarily difficult relationship between the religious engagement work and the promotion of religious freedom. It's not only the danger of us slipping into the idea that there's a sort of partisan distinction there, that conservatives care about religious freedom and progressives or liberals care about religious engagement. I think even among co-partisans, there was sometimes this sense that the the strategic religious engagement function and the religious freedom promotion function were in competition with each other. And so I think we do need to figure that out. Second, I think there are a set of challenges facing this work that are generated by the Establishment Clause of the U.S. Constitution and legal constraints around this work going forward. There are very good reasons that the U.S. Constitution sets guardrails around the relationship of the federal government to religion. But I think that sometimes the way those are interpreted and enacted in rules and policy and practice actually remove the power of religion as a source of values from the equation, when the whole point that we're trying to make is that religion is a powerful force precisely because of its content. And so questions about how we can engage the content of religion in this work while still being mindful of necessary legal constraints, I think is very important. And finally, just kind of thinking about the big picture of geopolitics, I think there was a period of time when this work was being developed when the United States, in terms of great powers in the world, had a bit of a monopoly in our capacity to do this work, to bring religious outreach and religious engagement into our national security and foreign policy and foreign assistance work. You look around the world today, there are other countries, many of whom that are considered strategic rivals of the United States. I think of Russia. I think counterintuitively even of China, a country that you usually think of as being sort of antithetical to religion when you think of the suppression of Christian groups in China, mass atrocities committed against Muslims in China's own western provinces. China is itself actually using religion as a soft power tool, reaching into its Buddhist heritage in order to build connections of solidarity along the geography of the Belt and Road Initiative. There are other global players that are making geopolitical uses of religion in ways that are fundamentally transforming the landscapes in which we do this work. And I think U.S. foreign policy, diplomacy, and development policy, or defense policy, need to get a better handle on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. You laid out quite a wide range of ways that religious engagement is important in the work that we do. Let me now turn to Martine. You've been working for many years with people of faith, including women and youth, where we've engaged the most on, as well as looking at the role of religion in formal peace processes, and we've partnered together on that. We heard some examples from Dr. Johnston about some of the ways that religious actors build peace in their communities and how we can engage in that space. I'm wondering if you could share some examples, but in the context of how that helps us in the future, looking for opportunities in the field of religious peace building and how we can grow in the future.
Thank you, Palwasha, and thank you everyone for being here, and thank you to USIP for co-hosting this event. It's been a work in progress, and it's a pleasure to be here. First, I want to highlight something. When I first started, I started in the State Department many, many years ago, and at that time, the discussion around religion was quite sensitive. So I worked in the Department of Human Rights and Labor, and we were working on the human rights reports, and at that time, they also wove in the international religious freedom reports. As I look and reflect on my career of working in conflict settings, progressively over the more recent years, what we've seen is a plethora of organizations that have developed in this space, where ICRD, Religions for Peace, USIP were some of the only first ones for a very long time. Also, the development of ambassadors for religious freedom, for instance. So we've seen this space grow and deepen. We still have a lot of work ahead because of the different dynamics that are taking place that we see on a daily scale, and look at the trends and trajectories of those contexts that we'll talk a little bit about in a second. First of all, I want to start off with last night, we went to sleep with news of first responders in the Potomac. This morning we woke up with news of first responders still at the Potomac working on recovery efforts. A big thank you to those first responders for all the work that they're doing. And also looking at, as I sat and I reflected on that last night and this morning, a lot of the colleagues and friends, now they're almost like family members, are those exact same first responders in their communities. I only have a few minutes, so I want to just very briefly highlight some. There are numerous more. There are colleagues sitting in this room that have a deep understanding of this space. Lujane is standing here. Lujane, put your hand up and wave at everybody. Aisha could do the same. Amira, Ray is in the back. We have our colleagues from Georgetown that are working closely with us, just to highlight some people in the room already that you could meet with after. I want to highlight a few things. I'm going to start with, oftentimes we look at conflict based by bound by borders. So we're talking about nation states, but oftentimes conflict doesn't stay within those borders, it ripples. We often have epicenters of conflict that have a creative way of rippling across regions and globally, and we're seeing that today. So I'm going to highlight a few of these. For instance, many years ago, we were very thankful for support from Norway to do an initiative within South and Southeast Asia that looked at the dynamics taking place and the interreligious dynamics that were playing out and the atrocities playing out in the region. During that time, we worked very closely with religious actors that sought, advice on what to do within the region, and we collaborated with them to create almost a network of religious actors that really looked at the broader region that they're living in, the implications for violence against others, and what that meant, and what role they could take as first responders, or what we identified as first movers. From that initiative, those religious actors, where they didn't necessarily see themselves as peacemakers, really stood up and said, okay, this is what we can do in the region and for our communities to build peacemaking efforts. And I'll give you a few examples of that. At the time, we were seeing a lot of violence against, for instance, the Rohingya population in Myanmar. We collaborated with Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Myanmar at that time, and also Bangladesh, and looked at the role of those religious actors in that space and what roles they could take forward. One thing they identified that they wanted to do as a collaborative effort is build an early warning and response mechanism. They had heard about it, they'd thought about what that could look like, but they had never really thought deeply about how they could do it in practice. So we brought them together and they worked on what does an early warning and response mechanism look like? How could they engage that within their countries, but also support each other across the region in that response effort? And so as we started talking about that and convening around early warning and response, what they started doing was forming interfaith councils and interfaith communities. And when they heard a rumor, for instance, in Myanmar, they all came together and they got together and they said, okay, how do we address this rumor? They dispersed the communities, communicated with their communities, and talked about the rumor and tried to better understand the rumor and de-escalated the violence. They also would escort people home if they felt there was violence that would be possibly implemented or held against them because of the situation. It's one example of many that happen within the South and Southeast Asia region around the dynamics that were taking place there. That network still lives today. They're really thriving, they're really working, and there are numerous people we'll get highlight that are doing amazing things across South and Southeast Asia. Another example would be Libya. During the fall of Gaddafi at the time, there wasn't a sense of being Libyan. The country broke down into regions, and so we might see that play out in the Syria case as we move forward and how that looks. What the religious and traditional actors did was they came together, formed a network, and they said, how do we become a movement of actors that we can discuss across our regions key conflicts that we're seeing, and how do we work through them, and what does it look like across the borders of our country? And then they identified a way to look at 3 conflicts that they could work on as traditional religious actors to mediate those conflicts. And so the idea from that group was to create a social contract within Libya. So their role was to think about how do we make sure that Libyan society works together and sees themselves as one society to work together rather than divisions. At that time, we also brought in young people, and then we also brought in women of faith actors into that space. Actually, the biggest conflict by bringing this group together actually happened between the traditional religious actors and the young people. And so we took a lot of time in engaging those 2 actors together to create a diplomatic space for them to be able to discuss their grievances and concerns, and then they solidified their role. Another one is now we're working closely on Sudan. There are colleagues in the room I know that are working closely on Sudan as well. That was a direct request from many, many years of working on Sudan. And their direct request is, how do we come forward as religious actors, as a religious community, and support peacemaking and engage at that peace process, peacemaking level. And so we're currently in that context at the moment and working closely with them to be able to achieve a goal there. I know we're hitting 11:30, but I'm going to mention one more point. We've been working closely over the years with USIP on the role of women of faith actors. There's a significant element to that, and Charity is going to give me a timeout, but there's a significant element to that. And the significant element to that is that oftentimes it's been interesting that women in these spaces don't recognize themselves as peacemakers. But the amazing work that they do to negotiate, for instance, the release of prisoners, the demobilization of children affiliated with armed forces, various steps in their communities has been significant. And I think that's one focus we need to continue to place on this space. We often we think of religious actors as male, but the role of women of faith actors in these spaces has been significant based on the studies that we've been able to pull forward and advance. So that's one other thing I want to highlight. The other thing we're working on is also, we talk a lot about division within the U.S. Ray Kim is sitting in the back. Ray, I'd like you to put your hand up. Ray Kim is working very closely with communities across the U.S., particularly religious communities, religious actors, on how to bring communities back together in dialogue. And so those are just a few, but I want to put one more thing, the final thing on the table, is the biggest thing that's come up most recently is all of these actors have done amazing work on the ground. Just astounding work on the ground. I wake up in the middle of the night with nonstop messages coming in and phone calls. And the thing that's come up most persistently is exactly what Peter's mentioned here, is around the geopolitical space. They are consistently asking, how do we work now within the geopolitical dynamics that we're seeing? So one thing as an organization we're doing is we have 3 Georgetown students with us today that are standing in the front, or sitting in the front here. They're working with us on an initiative for the Middle East to look at the geopolitical overlay of the conflict in the Middle East and how do we understand it, how do we share that information with policymakers, and how do we engage civil society in that geopolitical space to create a healthier environment for our work together. And that's a quick roundup. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Martine. I know we are here at the end of our time, but I wanted to give an opportunity to Dr. Johnston to also answer the question about the future and really where he sees this book going, the recommendations in your book and the things that have evolved over time. What would be the most ideal implementation, if you could just summarize today and as you look forward to the future?
Well, thank you for the question. I think that all of this, one of the bottom lines for all of us, not only nationally but individually, is that when another nation state is causing us serious problems, our tendency always is to start dehumanizing them so that we can make it easier to oppose them, if not destroy them. When in fact, if we could change that paradigm to reacting empathetically and trying to determine where is that common ground, where we can even possibly come up with a win-win situation. But sometimes that's too idealistic, but we need to do some real soul searching in terms of how we react to. And at a personal level, in our polarized atmosphere today, the same principle holds. One thing I would just say in terms of the State Department, in some levels, they took this to heart. For example, when Secretary Madeleine Albright had an advisory committee, I think it was about 20 folks. I think you were on it, David. Its purpose was to look at nation states where religious freedom wasn't being honored and to hit them with a hammer. Well, when this book came out, they actually said, okay, half of us will be doing that, but the other half are going to be looking for examples that are models that we can emulate. See, lift up, don't curse the light, the darkness, lift the light. And that's what we need to do. There are other aspects of what we've recommended that I think have yet to be implemented, if they ever will be. One of which was the idea of, in those countries where religion has particular salience, we need a religion attaché, somebody who's equipped to kind of deal with these sorts of issues. When you look at the different attachés that we do have in the mix, some of them are terribly irrelevant compared to religion. So that has just yet to happen. I also would just say, in looking to the future, one of the, I think a tremendous oversight on our part is that in none of the Middle East peace processes has religion ever been at the table, not even in a one-off capacity. But when President Clinton had Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat to Camp David to try to do another Jimmy Carter kind of thing, Barak exceeded his mandate. It was like he was giving away the store, and it was very questionable whether Israel was going to support that. But he met a dead silence from Arafat, because Arafat was not equipped by Islam to speak on matters like this final dispensation of Jerusalem and these sorts of things. So I think what's needed is religious leaders coming together, develop a religious framework for peace on which the political leaders can build. Because otherwise, we're going to always have this disconnect, and we're never going to ever find peace in the Middle East. So that would be my plea, to at least give that some thought.
Thank you so much for giving us that vision and inspiration for some steps forward. So as we close, I just want to give every panelist one last word. So if you could summarize in one sentence your response to Secretary Rubio's call that has asked us to answer that in everything we do, how does our work make America safer? How does our work make America stronger and more prosperous? So in your own words, in one sentence, how would you describe religious engagement in global diplomacy doing that? So can I start with you, Dr. Johnston?
Well, I think that particularly when you look at religious freedom, when you don't have religious freedom, there's no escape valve for the pressures that build in that arena. And stability suffers in the big picture. Stability suffers. Stability is what private industry needs. It's what all of us need to be able to get on with our lives. So I just, that would be my thought with respect to that.
Thank you for that, religious freedom.
That's a big question, Palwasha. I'm going to dream about this tonight. I would say, I think, I agree with Doug. I'm really impressed by you saying, as I always am when we have an opportunity to meet, to talk about the role of religious actors in the Middle East at the moment and what positive roles that they can play and how impactful and effective that will be as an example globally, and what that would mean for the safety and security of everyone across every religious faith, and also for the safety and security in the United States.
Thank you.
In one sentence, I suppose I would say work civilly but persistently to offer a different vision of the nation state from that offered by the religious nationalists.
Peter, one sentence.
One sentence? I think globally today, there is enormous frustration and a sense of alienation from prevailing political, economic, and military orders. Those that have been created by that set of processes and approach that we called international liberalism, for better or for worse. Religion is a space that has managed to maintain a certain separateness and moral authority in the face of the creation of those orders. And so there will be power in religion, in finding alternatives and moving beyond those contradictions.
So forgive me for stating the obvious, but sometimes the obvious is worth stating, right? I'll just conclude summarizing the safest and most prosperous place for the American people to be in a global world is a world in which principles of democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of assembly, freedom of political action, freedom of civil action are principles that are embedded across the globe, and that builds for us a world in which we have natural allies and natural synergies. To Peter's point earlier, our biggest global adversaries in the world today, if not atheists, are frequently, at least religiously binary, right? They're theocratic or they're religiously one-sided, and so a world in which democratic and pluralistic principles and freedom of speech are strongly defended is a safer world for American prosperity.
Paul,
Thank you. Yes,
could I add just another thought as well?
please.
One of the overriding concerns in national security is the prospective possible marriage of religious extremism with weapons of mass destruction. And one of the things that ICRD has done a lot of is trying to counter violence, terrorist thinking by engaging conservative members of those religious communities who aren't hard over on the violence, who are not the extremists. They are the ones that the extremists will listen to the most. So you engage them, and that's something to keep in mind as we move ahead, because that problem hasn't gone away. And I think all of us are kind of concerned about it. So.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnston, and for all of the panelists. You did a wonderful job of summing up, and I heard a lot about religious freedom and how it relates to stability. So first, a round of applause to all of our panelists. Second, I just wanted to close by saying here at USIP and in partnership with ICRD, we are planning to continue to have these conversations. We have been able to convene and host bipartisan conversations, some of the difficult conversations that Peter mentioned, and we will continue to host those spaces here to make sure that there is communication across the lines and there continues to be bipartisan action in this space. Martine, is there something you'd like to add?
I think just in connection to that, we're going to be thinking about successive meetings that take place and that we'll think about as we move forward. So keep an eye for any more communication. If you would like to speak with anyone that's engaged in ICRD or USIP, you can look around the room. There are quite a few here. So don't hesitate to reach out to us, because we're pleased to have these conversations and listen to your thoughts and share thoughts and collaborate further.
Thank you. I would like to actually end with the words of Reverend Susan Hayward, who was the director before I started directing the team and was a mentor to myself. And she gave these words at her state legislative in Minnesota. And in a way, it's a prayer that I would like to end with. God of many names, truth that sets us free, we gather today during an extraordinary time in this country, a Kairos moment, a time of discord when many feel anxiety and fear, when our society and systems are sputtering and seizing, and a time ripe with possibility for new ways of being together. May your creative and disruptive spirit arrive here today and loosen what has become stuck within us and between us, liberating us to move forward for the cause of love, pulling out a new world from the chasm of our own making. Thank you all.